Welcome to the Closed-Minded Podcast, where we read with an open mind in order to close it again on something solid. Well, it's been over a year since the last episode, although with COVID it feels like a decade, and I'm coming back to podcasting with a vengeance by wading into some controversial waters. But that's what we're about on this show, so buckle up. Today we're talking about a state medical board that is persecuting a family physician who dares to practice what's called informed consent with his patients, particularly as it relates to vaccines. Since this topic is guaranteed to invoke ignorant and uncharitable responses from certain people, let me get a few qualifiers out of the way before we dive in. I received vaccines growing up. For most of my adult life, I've had no strong or fully formed opinions about them. I was aware of the controversy over them, but I kept my distance because I knew it would be a time-consuming rabbit hole to go down. That said, my skepticism of the allopathic health industry generally has grown over the years, and that has really blossomed in the COVID era, as I watched our public health experts lie to us, misrepresent data, shift goalposts, emotionally manipulate us, and suppress rather than engage dissenting views right before my eyes. I am not anti-vaccine. Conceptually, I think they're a wonderful development of modern technology, but neither am I blindly pro every single vaccine, because I don't believe that they provide a one-size-fits-all solution for every person. Even more importantly, I am pro-freedom. And while I don't happen to think that being pro-freedom and being pro-vax are in conflict, many others disagree. This is where so much of the tension lies. I can be pro-vaccine, but against the groupthink and authoritarianism that permeates the pharmaceutical industry and the public health agencies who promote overly simplified narratives and then smear anyone who dissents. Whenever I hear doctors or politicians or journalists or other public health figures say, "You cannot talk about this," that raises huge red flags with me. So while it's true, I'm not qualified to authoritatively pontificate about if or when vaccines are harmful, I do have eyes, a nose, and a critical mind. And I do know when something stinks to high heaven. It turns out that my BS detector is in fine working condition, and I'm very qualified to use it. Consider this framing. Which camp do you want to be in? The one that wants to impose requirements on everyone and lacks all nuance and complexity, or the one that wants everyone to have freedom to make their own choices and manage their own risk? Here are a few foundational principles that I believe in, which directly impact vaccines and the practice of medicine. Doctors should be free to treat and serve their patients as they see fit, without interference. Parents should be free to accept or decline any medical intervention. That includes modifying the rate of vaccines for their kids. The CDC schedule did not come down from Mount Sinai etched on tablets by the hand of God. Informed consent is an essential component of medical freedom and autonomy, and most doctors do not actually practice this. I'm not stating an opinion on the quality of the CDC vaccine schedule when I say that if a doctor tells you, "We follow the CDC and you can either accept it or leave my practice," that is highly unethical. Don't support a doctor who abdicates his responsibility like this. I am not an expert. Neither are you. The best that we laymen can do when it comes to advocating for our various positions is to appeal to someone else's authority. That's what we all do. Now, here are two more observations and general truths that help frame my understanding of these issues. Governments and bureaucracies abuse their power on a regular basis. The events of the COVID era have proven this many times over. 2, public health agencies are just as likely to misrepresent science as they are to accurately portray it. My guest today has documented this many times over in his journalism. We cannot take their word at face value. To do so is to abandon one's critical thinking skills. As my guest says in our discussion, if all you read is the mainstream media, you are misinformed. So with that, let's get into the episode. Today, we've got Jeremy R. Hammond. He's an independent journalist and a researcher. He's written a brand new book called The War on Informed Consent, The Persecution of Dr. Paul Thomas by the Oregon Medical Board. And I'm excited to have him on the show today. Jeremy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
So I guess let's just start with this. Define informed consent for me and for the listeners, and just explain what that is, and then in what way is it under attack?
Sure. So the right to informed consent is one of the most fundamental ethics in medicine, established as such after World War II, when the Nazis were performing experiments on human subjects. And so what it is basically we all have a right, to determine what medical procedures we undergo. what goes into our bodies with vaccines, for example. And so, this is a fundamental human right that, nobody can force pharmaceutical products on us, that we must have a choice, and we must be able to make an informed choice. And so the idea of informed consent is that, if you do undergo a medical procedure, that you have all the information you need to be able to make that choice reasonably. So you're informed of what the benefits could potentially be and what the risks could potentially be. And so the problem that we're having with the vaccine issue is that the informed consent is practically non-existent. I mean, there isn't informed consent doesn't happen in the United States. So people are being coerced and intimidated into vaccinating. They're being deceived about the risks and benefits as opposed to having good information about the risks and benefits. So people are making decisions based on propaganda and falsehoods and deceptions, as opposed to, so it's uninformed consent essentially. So this is a big problem, obviously. People, and our health freedom is under assault. We're parents who want to have their kids in school. Obviously, there's school mandates for vaccines. We're seeing this is escalated now with COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccines being rolled out, where now people are being forced to get COVID-19 vaccines against the will, lest they lose their jobs. Students in colleges are being forced to get the vaccine to be able to stay in school. The right to informed consent is really under assault. And so the title of the book, The War on Informed Consent, I think is an appropriate title, because it really is like an all-out war. I mean, there are people who are fighting to take away our ability to make our own choice about our own health. People like Richard Pan, the California senator, who was kind of cheerleading two pieces of legislation there. First, to eliminate what are called non-medical exemptions, even though it might be based on medical science, the reason for the exemption, but they call them non-medical exemptions because they don't fit, they're not based on the CDC's narrow criteria for what they call contraindications, meaning a reason why not to get the vaccine, which is very narrow and inadequate. I mean, there are, for example, they don't take into account family history, family history of autoimmune disease, for example. So if a doctor has a patient, pediatric patient who whose family has a history of autoimmune disease, for example, and they are concerned about vaccines causing problems and contributing, so it might be that there's, certain children, this is one of the things, that certain children are at greater risk of vaccine injury than other children. That risk is not equal for everyone. And one of the problems is we don't really know who those children might be who are at high risk of vaccine injury, because they're not doing those types of studies. They're not doing that type of research, but we do have some ideas. Family history of autoimmune disease, just the example I'm sticking with here. So doctor writes an exemption for the family because they're concerned. They don't want to vaccinate due to family medical history, but the state of California doesn't recognize that, right? And so the second piece of legislation, after eliminating non-medical exemptions, they pushed through the legislation to essentially also eliminate medical exemptions, meaning that they're overriding the doctor's decision. So Dr. Richard Pan, he is a doctor as well as a senator, legislator. His view is that when doctors write exemptions for vaccinations, they are not practicing medicine. They are performing an administrative function in service to the state. That's authoritarianism. But this is the direction that not just California, but the entire country is moving toward. That this idea that there is no doctor-patient relationship, informed consent for the parents is not an option. Parents must do what they're told. And any doctors who enable parents to make decisions and make their own choices about vaccines for their children are also now under attack. And this is what happened to Dr. Paul Thomas. So he respects his patients' right to informed consent. He enables them to make their own choices. He doesn't push the vaccine schedule, the CDC's vaccine schedule, on the parents. He tries to provide as much information as he can so that they can make their own informed choice. They do make their own informed choice. And this is a problem from the perspective of the Oregon Medical Board and Oregon State government, this is a problem.
Yeah. So let's dig a little bit into Dr. Thomas's history. Not necessarily going all the way back to Africa, which is where I think he grew up, but kind of the start with his professional career. My understanding is, he became a physician. He held conventional views about vaccines and about the CDC schedule, and was, doing what most physicians do. And then somewhere along the way, I think maybe triggered by encounters that he had with his patients, he started to ask some questions and do some additional research. And I guess maybe take it from there or fill in some of the gaps there. What was his progression from starting off as sort of a conventional physician into where he's at now?
Yeah, no, that's accurate. What you've just described. He started out, as he described it in my interview with him, just doing what he was trained to do. And this is the thing that, and he explains that doctors aren't really taught much about vaccines. What they learn about vaccines in medical school is just the basic, vaccines are awesome. They saved us from all these diseases, and you should do what the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics tell you to do. Just follow the guidelines, follow the mandates from those organizations. He believed that, and he as he describes it, he wasn't really skeptical of that from the start, and he practiced that in his practice once he got into a group practice after medical school. But in time, he did start questioning things and doubting things. And he says one of the things that kind of opened his eyes to the possibility that vaccines aren't as awesome as we're all told, was the 1998 paper in The Lancet by Dr. Andrew Wakefield and co-authors. Which of course, we're all supposed to believe that this was this big fraudulent study that was the origin of the anti-vaccine movement and such, which we could get into, but I'll just skip over that for now. But he actually attributes, Andy Wakefield for kind of opening his eyes to that possibility. And so that was one of the things, and he started going to conferences from an organization. I forget the organization's name. It's now defunct, but it did evolve into another organization that still exists today. But he started just going to these conferences related to, just research on autism, and really, he described them as just a deep, deep dive into the science. And he compared them to the AAP's conferences that he was going to. He described the AAP's conferences as weak in comparison in terms of like the science that he was learning. And so he started doing his own research and just, this is something he described during medical school. You don't have time to do your own research. You just kind of learn what you learn, and then you move right into practice based on the things that you learned in medical school. And so most doctors probably don't do much of their own research. But he started taking deep dives into the science and studying the literature for himself, and really had an awakening so that, he became what he describes as vaccine risk aware, as opposed to his prior ignorance. He became vaccine risk aware. And eventually he kind of had a parting with his group practice. There were four doctors in that clinic. So the three other ones he was working with, kind of, they wanted to continue doing things the way that they were taught. They wanted to recommend the CDC's vaccine schedule to all their patients and kind of push the schedule on them. And Dr. Paul Thomas decided that he could no longer in good conscience continue that behavior as a pediatrician. So he left and he opened his own clinic in Portland, where the founding principle is respecting the right to informed consent. And then he also, that kind of journey that he was on led him to write the book, The Vaccine Friendly Plan, with co-author Jennifer Margulis. And of course, the Vaccine Friendly Plan was basically, it provided an alternative schedule to the CDC's schedule. That the main idea, there are a number of different ideas behind it, but one of the big ones was that, the risk from aluminum. So there's aluminum adjuvant in many vaccines, childhood vaccines. And this is one of the major health concerns about vaccines, is that the aluminum, which of course is neurotoxin, is causing harm to children. Excuse me. And so his schedule was designed to basically to minimize the exposures to aluminum. That was one of the main ideas of his alternative schedule. However, the really fundamental idea was that, there has to be individualized care. It can't be like, he wasn't providing an alternative one size fits all approach. He wasn't saying, well, don't do it the CDC's way, do it this way. That wasn't the idea.
Which would be falling into the same error that the CDC schedule made.
Precisely. That would be the exact same kind of fallacious thinking that the CDC is having. And with the medical establishment, they have this one size fits all solution where there's like the idea of individualized vaccination, making decisions on each vaccine for each child individually. This concept is non-existent in the medical establishment. And so that was the concept behind the vaccine friendly plan, is that, here is an example alternative schedule that's designed to minimize aluminum exposure, for example.
Yeah, I'm about a third of the way through it. And the one thing that has stood out to me right away is just the lack of prescription. Like, he's not saying you have to do it this way. He's just laying out, well, there's risk to this and there's risk to that. And you have to make a consideration for each particular child, which, to me, just strikes me as totally reasonable. Like, there's nuance and complexity involved with making any medical decision. And, even if I thought that, let's say I did think that the CDC schedule was great and there weren't any problems with it, I would still be opposed to the imposition of it by the entire medical infrastructure. And, because what we tend to hear is sit down and shut up and just take your medicine, or take the things in the order that we give you. And, I've never had particularly strong opinions on vaccines in general. I think I've always been pro-vaccine as a concept. But I am always aware of an environment where you're not allowed to ask questions. And so that has made me skeptical of a lot of just the whole vaccine industry, not because I'm an expert on any particular vaccine, or because I'm even necessarily skeptical of the efficacy of a particular vaccine, COVID notwithstanding. But I would say that just the fact that you're not allowed to ask questions or have any nuance or complexity in your discussions of vaccines raises huge red flags when just thinking about the mainstream approach to these topics. And so it creates a skepticism in me by their behavior, not even by the science specifically.
Precisely. Yeah. I mean, that's a really excellent point. That the fact that they have this one size fits all approach, and they refuse to even acknowledge, that, well, look, each child has a different risk for the disease, for example. I mean, if a child is at very low risk for the disease and yet has certain maybe genetic factors that might put them at higher risk of vaccine injury, well, it's reasonable for parents to think that, well, maybe their child shouldn't receive that vaccine. But I mean, you can't even ask questions like that.
Right.
You can't even that's like blasphemy. I mean, that even suggesting something like that, suggesting that, well, this child, anything outside of the CDC's recognized contraindications is like blasphemous. And so, you're committing heresy against vaccine religion when you do that. And so the fact that it's so dogmatic and it's so institutionalized.
Yes.
The dogmatism is so institutionalized, that by itself, like you said, is a huge red flag. Like, something's not right here.
Yeah. And to take a slight tangent that's applicable at that point to the whole COVID phenomena is, I think that the brazenness at which they've changed, I'm not talking about the vaccine schedule at this point. I'm just talking about the public health establishment's response to COVID. But the brazenness at which they have changed the goalpost and shifted advice around and changed recommendations seemingly every 5 minutes. And it has, I think, really served to wake a lot of people up to, the lack of credibility and the absurdity within the medical establishment, that they've lost all credibility and they've done it at their own hand. Like, there have been plenty of people that just believed the common, perspective on anything related to vaccines or to treatment or pandemic response or masks or whatever. But just by the sheer insanity and hypocrisy that we've seen over the last 18 months, it's woken a lot of people up, which is good. I think it's also, it's bad that it took so much hypocrisy and authoritarianism to wake people up to it, but I'm glad that they are waking up to it.
Yeah. There's definitely some positive outcomes as a result of events. And certainly, I think there has been kind of a mass awakening. Because before the pandemic, it was kind of like, from my perspective, of course, many of us have been speaking out against certain, policies, the mandates and things, well before the pandemic. So, but before the pandemic, when we were talking about natural herd immunity, it's like that was some kind of like loony, like pseudoscience,
which is insane, because that's been the standard for decades, understanding.
Right. Well, so now there's like this, yeah, exactly. There's just been this awakening, this understanding of like, well, natural herd immunity, like that's a real phenomenon, right? It's not like something we're making up, like that exists, and it's even built into the lockdowners' own models, right?
Right.
And so another example, antibodies. Before, like we would be talking about antibodies, and we'd be trying to explain to people, well, like, look, immunity doesn't equal antibodies, and antibodies don't equal immunity. Like there's a lot, the immune system is much more complex than that.
Right. Yeah. We were having a conversation over the weekend with my family about this very issue. And some of my comments were from what I had learned from your recent, one of your newsletters, where you were talking about, antibodies, and that's not the only type of immunity. And in fact, high antibody levels can even be an indication of greater disease. And just because you don't have antibodies doesn't mean that you're not immune.
Yep.
And just, all of this complexity around that, which gets flattened in the public conversation to where antibody equals immunity. And if you don't have it, then you're not immune and you're at risk. And it's so simplistic.
Right. It's simplistic and false and unscientific. But fortunately, despite that kind of like, there has been that propaganda. All last summer, the summer of 2020, it was like media report after media report talking about these studies that were showing, the antibodies are rapidly lost and people are losing their immunity. It's just like all this fear-mongering propaganda. And of course, but at the same time, there has been this kind of awakening, because that propaganda kind of backfired on them, because people started thinking like, they said, if natural immunity doesn't last very long and it's quickly lost, but then the vaccines is designed to try to mimic the natural immune response. So therefore, probably the vaccines won't be very effective either. And whatever immunity is conferred by the vaccines will also be quickly lost. People were kind of intuitively drawing these conclusions. So there was all this kind of, it was creating this kind of public skepticism about the developmental vaccines that were not yet approved. And so then they had to start backtracking. They started having to explain, like the New York Times started having to explain. It's like, well, don't worry, because it's not all about antibodies.
And yeah.
And then they started to explain it to people. Yeah. Right.
I know we're kind of mutually geeking out on our skepticism here, but I want to shift into one thing. For the people that are listening who maybe are not as aware or skeptical of some of the mainstream received wisdom as we are, who haven't read as much, who are more, and again, this is not a criticism, just more conventionally minded and have believed what, the mainstream narrative has been, which is okay. Most people do that. Most people are in that camp. So I guess maybe let's just talk a little bit about, let's unpack some of the nuances related to some of the vaccines on the CDC schedule to give somebody an understanding of why there's more to it than just it's on the schedule, so it's a great fit for everybody. So in particular, through three sort of lenses that I want to ask you to just maybe explain. One is, when you're evaluating the protection, conferred by a vaccine, and compared to natural immunity, let's talk about length of protection, so the amount of time. Let's talk about breadth of protection, meaning what all does it protect you from? And then also talk about shedding. Hey guys, just want to take a moment to let you know about NordVPN. If you've been paying attention at all over the last couple of years, then you know that privacy and security should be essential components of your digital life. You need to protect your internet connection on all of your devices, especially your phone. I've been a customer with Nord for over 3 years, and their app is fast and flexible. I will never use a public Wi-Fi network again without a VPN, and Nord is my favorite. Protect your data and support the show by going to closemindedpodcast.com/VPN or the show notes page of this episode. Their current offer will get you 72% off with a 2-year plan. That amounts to just over $3 a month to secure the internet connection on up to 6 devices. That's your phones, your laptops, your routers, etc. So go to closemindedpodcast.com/VPN or the show notes page of this episode. Now let's get back to the show.
Was there a particular vaccine you wanted to kick it off with?
Here, well, let's talk about MMR and like the issues of whether multiple doses are necessary.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Yeah, the MMR is actually right about that in the book, in the War on Informed Consent. One of the accusations that the Oregon Medical Board made against Dr. Paul Thomas was that he was doing antibody tests for patients. And then in parents were using those to make decisions about whether to give the second dose of MMR, the measles vaccine. And so they accused him of ordering unnecessary tests. And this was like this big criticism of Dr. Paul. However, the thing is that what the Oregon Medical Board was overlooking was the fact that it's the second dose of vaccination itself that is, for most children, by the CDC's own acknowledgement, unnecessary. So the second dose, the purpose of the second dose, the CDC, you can read this in the MMWR, the CDC's publication. I mean, when they added a second dose to the schedule, they explained why. It wasn't because most children need it. It was because a certain percent of children, something like 5% of children, I think was their estimate, who receive the first dose, they don't seroconvert, meaning that they don't that vaccination doesn't induce what they just consider to be a protective level of antibodies. So the 95% of children who get the first dose, they seroconvert, and then they have that protective antibody level, which is sustained for quite a long time. It's not as durable as natural immunity, which is generally lifelong in duration. It does wane over time, but measles is one of the vaccines where the duration of immunity is quite long. It would typically last into adulthood. And so for most children, they don't need the second dose. It's not required. So the reason for the second dose is because they want to just catch up that 5% of children who didn't seroconvert. They want to catch those children and give them a second opportunity to seroconvert. And among those children, again, a certain proportion still will not seroconvert, and there'll be vaccine failure, where it doesn't stimulate a protective immune response. And so it goes through, they can get from 95% to 97%, for example,
right,
of children who seroconvert. So it's to get those a couple of percentage of children to seroconvert that they mass vaccinate all children with a second dose. So it's really mostly completely unnecessary.
And are there any risks to doing a second dose? Or because I could hear somebody say, well, why not just do it? What's the big deal?
Yeah, it's not that's the problem. It's not a risk-free. I mean, no vaccine is a risk-free pharmaceutical product. I mean, there are always risks involved when you vaccinate. And so this is one of the problems. So if you're going to do an unnecessary risk-carrying intervention, that is not very scientific. It's not very conducive to public health. I mean, it's basically all risk and no benefit.
But they came after him for doing this, right? The state board,
right? But of course, they didn't acknowledge the fact that the second dose is unnecessary for most children, according to the CDC itself. I mean, if you go back to the MMWR report. Back when the CDC first started recommending the second dose, because initially there was only the one dose of MMR, and then there was these vaccine failure phenomenon, and there were all these outbreaks among vaccinated children, and so they added the second dose, and they explain right in there their reasoning for it. And it wasn't because, oh, well, most children need a second dose. It was because very few children can benefit from a second dose. And so they just cast a really broad net. So if you think about it, it makes sense to do an antibody titer test to determine a child's, because with measles, there is an antibody, there is a correlate of immunity with measles, meaning that that there's a certain level of antibodies that does correlate with protection from disease. And of course, there's cellular immunity and other immune mechanisms. Like, it's not as simple as just antibodies, but in this case, there is that correlate of immunity that has been established. And so it makes sense for parents to say, okay, well, if my child has a protective level of antibodies, well, then chances are they're immune. I mean, in all probability, that is an indication of immunity. That is essentially proof of immunity. It's not absolutely 100% scientific proof, but it is a correlate of immunity. And so, so that makes perfect sense, because if they already have a protective level of antibodies, then why would they do the second dose? Why would they put their child at that unnecessary risk of harm? So it makes perfect sense. And so what Dr. Paul Thomas was doing was perfectly sensible. And of course, there's obviously much less risk in getting a blood test than in getting a vaccination. And so it made a lot of sense, but they came after him for it. And that was one of the criticisms that they had in their suspension order when they suspended his license.
So, I mean, it boggles the mind that it's one thing, even though I would still disagree with it, if the medical board is going to come after somebody for straying from the official recommendation. But when they come after him for actually following the recommendation and to the T and doing exactly what the CDC is asking, like, what are we to conclude from that? Like, what does that say about what the real goals are of the Oregon State Medical Board?
Yeah, I got to mention that too. You just triggered, I should have added this, that it's actually written into Oregon State law that it is acceptable for doctors to do antibody testing. And it's acceptable that, and so if the result of this test is that the child has a protective level of antibodies, they have that antibody titer, then that is considered proof of immunity under Oregon State law. And under Oregon State law, if they have proof of immunity, that second dose is not required for school attendance. It's right in the law. And yet, so Dr. Paul Thomas is literally following the law to the letter, and yet they're accusing him of being an irresponsible doctor as a result. I mean, the hypocrisy is so staggering.
Yeah.
That this is what the Oregon Medical Board has done in these accusations. And, the other accusations contained in that suspension order are similar in their hypocrisy. And like, there's just essentially, they have this false pretext that he is a threat to public health. That by doing these antibody titer tests, that's a threat to public health. Give me a break. The thing is when I read that suspension order, it was so transparently false in its pretext that, I mean, I knew I had to kind of drop whatever else I was doing. And like, I had to write about this, about how the Oregon Medical Board, because it was so transparent that the real reason that they suspended his license had nothing to do with him being, some kind of irresponsible doctor, but everything to do with the fact that he had a lower vaccination rate in his clinic because he respects informed consent. And parents flocked to him precisely for that reason, because they're sick and tired. Well, number one, they'd get expelled from other pediatric practices because they were declining vaccines. And so, they needed a medical home for their child, right? So they would flock to Dr. Paul Thomas because he was one of the few doctors available who would like respect their choices. Or they would have vaccine injured children, and in the doc, even despite having already been vaccine injured, the other doctors would like still pushing the CDC schedule on them, and they were just like, no, we need to slow down here, we need backup. And so they would go to Dr. Paul because they don't want to be intimidated and pressured into doing something that their conscience is screaming, no, we shouldn't be doing this to our child. And so of course he had a lower vaccination rate in his clinic. I mean, that's what happens when you have informed consent. And so that was the true reason. I mean, when you when you eliminate the through logic and reason, the false pretext, what's left is that was the true reason that he was attacked, was the state can't tolerate doctors practicing informed consent.
Yeah. So let me make an analogy, and I'm curious. Tell me what you think, if this isn't a legitimate one. But it occurred to me, for those who are maybe still skeptical of any challenges to, the official formalized recommendation that is the CDC schedule, and for how a vaccine should be administered and applied to a population. What if we had took that reasoning and applied it to the realm of health and fitness, diet and exercise? Like, imagine if the CDC came out and said, you know what, everybody needs to follow a meat diet. And any of these doctors who are advocating for, a vegan diet or a plant-based diet, or, there's a dime a dozen, there's a million of these customized, health and fitness and eating programs, regimens out there. Imagine if the CDC comes out and says, this is the science. There's one plan for you to get healthy and get in shape. This is what you have to do. This diet combined with high intensity workouts 3 days a week, and, this much water a day and these vitamins. And if you're not doing this schedule that we decide is the science trademark, then you're out of compliance and you're not serving your patients. And this is outside the standard of care, and we're going to come after you. Like, imagine if they tried to put a stake in the ground in that topic. Like, it would be insanity. Is that a good analogy?
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. I mean, because this is the thing. Once if they can say, we have, this is literally what the state's position is. I mean, if you think about it logically, this is what the state is saying, is that they have a right to put things into your body against your will. That's kind of the fundamental underlying assumption, that you do not have a right to informed consent. You do not have a right to make a choice. You must obey orders. So they want to possess your body. They want to have ownership over your body. And so if they can tell you that you must get a vaccine, what else can they? Where does that logic end? Where does it stop? And so your analogy kind of just extend. If you take the logic and the reasoning and extend it, I mean, it's a kind of a reductio ad absurdum argument, but that's, I mean, it's a good analogy for that reason, because it shows, like, if we follow this logic through to its conclusions, to its corollaries, this is the state. This would be the state of affairs in the country.
Yeah. Once you see the point, once you see the principle, then it can be applied elsewhere. And another way I've heard it said is that if you leave the key under the doormat, somebody else is going to come along and use it.
Right, exactly. And so, it's kind of, kind of the boiling frogs analogy type of thing, where it's like, if you let them take an inch, they're going to take a mile, right? I mean, if you don't fight hard to maintain that inch of ground, I mean, you're going to lose it. And so once they have unopposed power to do one thing, they're going to extend that power. And where does the authoritarianism end? And it's also a good analogy because it illustrates, obviously everyone has a different body type. I mean, what might be good for me in terms of diet might not be good for you in terms of diet.
Right. And
this idea that everyone should be eating the same diet and that there's some kind of optimal diet for all of humanity. I mean, it's the same thing with vaccines. The idea that you can have back into that, the idea of vaccinations as a one size fits all solution, and all children should have the exact same schedule of vaccinations, is so profoundly unscientific.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked about length of protection a little bit. Let's go to breadth of protection, like against variants or against, things that maybe natural immunity would confer that a targeted vaccine would not. I can't remember which one it is. You probably know off the top of your head, but I remember you're reading your description about one where I think it was maybe associated with increased child mortality, but then also that the natural immunity conferred, it applied to like multiple variants or like a broader range of the disease than what the vaccine conferred, which again is not to argue either way that one is better. It's just that you have to consider all of the factors when you make a decision. Do you remember which vaccine that was?
They might be conflating two there. So one is the pertussis vaccine, which in terms of duration is quite short-lived. I mean, this is now quite well established that the duration of immunity from vaccination against pertussis is several years. I mean, it's quite short. And in terms of breadth, in terms of robustness, I would say of the immune response, natural immunity is far superior. Natural immunity, it does wane over time, but it will last into adulthood, as opposed to just a couple of years. And so the other thing is that natural immunity is protective against reinfection and transmission, whereas the vaccine doesn't prevent transmission. It doesn't prevent infection. And so one of the reasons for this is again, the vaccine is designed to provoke this antibody response. It's really geared towards antibodies. And so it's an aluminum containing vaccine. And the reason for the aluminum in there is it provokes a stronger immune response, a more inflammatory immune response with downstream higher antibody levels. So that's why they put the aluminum in the vaccine, is to reach that level of antibodies that the regulatory agency requires, that FDA requires, in order for them to be able to say, oh, so this is a correlative immunity, right? This antibody titer. And so it's there for them to be able to get approval from the FDA. That's for the purpose of the aluminum. And so because it's really geared towards stimulating this antibody response, but they kind of, when they developed the vaccine, they really ignored. I mean, number one, they didn't understand immunity to pertussis when they developed the vaccine. Similarly with COVID-19 vaccines, I mean, they developed the vaccines before they really even understood. To this day, there's no established correlate of immunity with COVID-19. They still don't know exactly like what it is, like how is it that immunity works. I mean, they have some pretty good ideas, but it's certainly not all about antibodies. T-cell immunity is equally or more important. And so this is what happens with the pertussis vaccine. So when we have natural immunity, it also confers, there's mucosal immunity, which is very important for prevention of infection, because of course the infection is through the respiratory tract, right? So, it gets in the lungs. And so the mucosal immunity is very important for prevention of infection and transmission. The vaccine doesn't confer mucosal immunity. And so people who vaccinated children can still become infected and spread the bacteria to others. Mm-hmm. So that, that's an example. And so, natural immunity really needs to be seen as an opportunity cost of vaccination. And here's the thing, there's this phenomenon of original antigenic sin, related phenomenon of what's called linked epitope suppression. And so what happens is that it's not always the case, but it can be the case where the original priming of the immune system kind of dictates the immune response to a pathogen for the rest of the individual's life. And what can happen is that can actually prejudice the immune response in a negative way compared to how a naive individual might have responded to that vaccine, to that pathogenic challenge. Okay, so for example, what happens is children whose immune systems were primed with the pertussis vaccine, when they do become re-exposed to pertussis, it's not as though that their natural immunity, it's not as though they then gain natural immunity, the same type of immunity as if they had been naive and had never been vaccinated. That's not the case, because the original priming has now prejudiced their immune response so that they will never acquire the same type of immunity as natural immunity. They can't go back. And so they will never acquire that stronger, robust, more durable immunity that unvaccinated exposed children would get. And so that's, in the case of the pertussis vaccine, the phenomenon is linked epitope suppression. It's just a name for it.
Now you called it pathogenic priming, is that right?
Yeah, well, it's kind of type of pathogenic priming where there's a related phenomenon called original antigenic sin, where for example, if you're exposed to your initial exposure to influenza is one particular strain, and then it evolves, and down the road you're exposed to a different strain of influenza, but your immune system is going to respond as though it was that original strain. So it's a suboptimal immune response. This can happen with natural infection. It can happen with vaccinations. The thing is, with the influenza vaccine, it's much less likely to happen with natural immunity.
Why does it happen with natural infection? I guess I didn't know that.
Why does it happen?
Yeah.
The same reason. I mean, it's just because the immune system learns. And so it was trained. I mean, so it's kind of like Yoda. You have to unlearn what you have learned. The immune system has a hard time unlearning what it learned, right? And so it comes at it, you know, when there's a re-exposure, it comes at it like, oh, I've already seen this before, right? So I'm going to respond the same way I responded the first time.
But because it's a slightly different variant, it's not the original response is not sufficient to drive out the second infection.
So you have a suboptimal immune response.
So then does your body not develop, I guess, does it not broaden its natural immunity to that new strain as it gets exposed?
Certainly it can, yeah. And so this isn't always the case. It's not always the case with every virus or every vaccine that original antigenic sin happens or linked epitope suppression happens. So it's not the case that that's always true. I mean, it depends on the pathogen and it depends on the vaccine. And so, but we do know, I mean, with the pertussis vaccine, it is the case that, you know, with another pathogen, it might be that, okay, they get the vaccination and then maybe they have kind of the suboptimal immunity from the vaccination, but then they're re-exposed and it's kind of like this booster effect, and it broadens and expands their immune repertoire so that they basically now have like natural immunity, right? The equivalent
right. And that's the positive result of that. Now, is it, correct me if I'm wrong, is the negative, the alternate route that it could take that's negative, is that where we get like antibody dependent enhancement and a cytokine storm, that sort of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And so this is the problem with the COVID-19 vaccines, is that we don't know yet. I mean, number one, we don't know whether there is, you know, whether original antigenic sin is going to occur or not. So for example, in other words, if a person is vaccinated and then they experience vaccine failure, what they call a breakthrough infection, that they still get an infection, does that exposure to the virus result in a broadening of the immune response such that they now have the equivalent of natural immunity?
Right.
Or will there be that phenomenon where the original antigenic sin phenomenon of that priming of the immune system by vaccination is now prejudicing the immune response so that they're still going to have suboptimal immunity? We don't know the answer to that question yet.
Right.
As far as I know, it hasn't been studied yet. Nobody is looking at that.
We don't know definitively what that looks like in a human population for COVID-19 vaccines, but we do know that previous attempts to develop a vaccine for something in the coronavirus family has always failed at the animal stage because of that very problem, and all the animals died. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. So with ADE, it's a little bit different from original antigenic sin because antibody dependent enhancement, because it's not just that the immune response is suboptimal compared to what it otherwise might be if the person was naive and had this pathogenic challenge.
And just naive means not exposed to vaccine immunity, right?
Yeah, immunologically naive. Yeah, it hadn't been exposed yet, either by vaccination or from the wild virus. And so with ADE, what happens is it's not just suboptimal, but it's actually detrimental. So that the antibodies that are created, they're non-neutralizing antibodies. They don't neutralize the virus, and in fact, far from stopping the virus from being able to enter and infect cells and replicate in cells, they actually act as a Trojan horse and make the virus more infectious. And this is why with the SARS-1 vaccine development, they ran into this problem of antibody dependent enhancement, where the animals that were vaccinated got sicker. And so, and this is something that's been seen before. It's been seen with the dengue virus vaccine that was rolled out in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
It ended up killing a bunch of children because it actually increased their risk from the disease because of antibody dependent enhancement.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this is a very real concern. I mean, the risk right now for the COVID-19 vaccines is theoretical. I mean, I haven't seen data suggesting that people who are vaccinated are getting sicker. I mean, it does appear to me that the vaccine does moderate the disease so that it's less severe. Even if somebody does get infected, then maybe they're probably less likely to be hospitalized or to die from it. So it does appear to offer that level of protection. However, the question is, number one, how long is that going to last? And it appears already that it's not lasting very long. It's certainly not natural immunity, we know, I mean, with natural immunity to SARS-CoV-2, when you recover from infection, your body develops B cells, memory B cells, that then differentiate into what are called long-lived bone marrow plasma cells. So these cells reside in your bone marrow, and if you're ever re-exposed to that virus again, they can rapidly ramp up antibody production. In addition to cellular immune responses, T cell responses, but just looking at antibodies. So a decline in antibodies with natural immunity is not a concern, because your body can produce all the antibodies it needs anytime it wants, like very rapidly. It doesn't have to relearn how to do that, and they're very highly, they actually evolve over time, so that if you're exposed to a different variant, like your body can learn very rapidly once it's had the original exposure. It's kind of like the opposite of original antigenic sin. With natural immunity to SARS-CoV-2, that doesn't happen. That what happens is that your body actually can adapt very rapidly to any new variant with natural immunity. This hasn't been shown with vaccine conferred immunity. In fact, it's quite obvious with the Delta variant that the vaccines are not highly effective. I mean, the effectiveness compared to the original strains is much lower. This is acknowledged. It's not controversial. And so we don't know the duration for one, but also the breadth. I mean, if you consider with natural immunity, your immune system is responding. There are epitopes on the virus. So epitopes are molecular regions of the virus that your immune system can recognize and mount a response to, such as an antibody. So when you have the wild virus and you're infected with the virus, your immune system is mounting responses to all of the epitopes on the virus. So it's not just about the spike protein. There's the nucleocapsid protein and the membrane protein and other proteins. Whereas the vaccines only induce immune responses to a genetically modified spike protein modeled on the original Wuhan strain of the virus, which is now extinct.
Right. Yeah, a really good analogy that I heard to explain that was like, if you've got two football teams playing each other and they're on the line, and you've got some defensive linemen that are really good at stopping when somebody runs the ball, then as long as the ball's being run, like, they're going to shut that down every time, and it's going to be great, and they're going to win, and it's going to be great. But as soon as they try to throw the ball or pass it, then their defense, which is a one size fits all response, they have no defense against a pass play. And so that's what the spike protein designed by the vaccine is doing. It's targeting one particular spike protein on the surface of the virus, and there's upwards of 20 or so that could potentially be attack vectors into your system. And natural immunity confers protection on all of them, whereas the vaccine confers protection on one.
Yeah, there was one study, I think they put the number at something like 1,400, over 1,400 different epitopes that they had identified. Wow. That with natural immunity, you gain all of those, that whole repertoire of immune responses. So coming back to the ADE thing though, so the point I'm getting at is with vaccination, just because, again, I haven't seen data suggesting that ADE is happening now. However, we do already see that that the effectiveness of the vaccine is less against the Delta variant than it was against earlier variants. And I've also read a paper describing how the antibodies with natural immunity, the antibodies that are acquired are generally neutralizing antibodies. So that you look at the concentration of neutralizing versus non-neutralizing antibodies that are produced, there's a higher proportion of neutralizing antibodies. But with the vaccination, you get a higher level of antibodies, but they're mainly non-neutralizing antibodies. It's a very interesting study. And so there is a concern that even though we might not be seeing ADE right now, that as the virus evolves to escape vaccine-conferred immunity, which is much more likely than it evolving to escape natural immunity, again, because of the breadth of the repertoire of the immune response. In fact, the spike protein is the least conserved region. When we talk about the variants, so what they're talking about is mutations in the spike protein. I mean, you don't read about, it mutated, there's a mutation in the nucleocapsid, and therefore, we have this other variant. They don't even talk about that. It's always about the spike protein. So the other regions of the virus are more conserved, meaning that they don't tend to mutate to escape immunity. So that those types of mutations are happening in the spike protein, which of course is the one thing that the vaccines are designed to mount an immune response to. So the possibility remains, coming to the point that, a variant might emerge. In fact, not just a possibility, it may be a likelihood that mass vaccination is going to actually put evolutionary pressure on the virus to evolve.
Yes.
An escape mutant that may then start seeing the phenomenon of antibody dependent enhancement, because people are mounting, they have this high titer of antibodies. The vaccine might induce these high levels of antibodies, but there'll be non-neutralizing antibodies that are not just suboptimal, but you may have that Trojan horse effect where the antibodies actually help the virus to gain entry even more easily into the cells, which is what antibody-dependent enhancement is.
Right. I think it's maybe a Belgian or a German scientist, I don't remember his name, who has, I think, been trying to raise the alarm about this since last year, saying that attempting to vaccine a population in the middle of a pandemic after it started is only going to do more harm than good, and actually give that evolutionary pressure to vaccine-resistant variants. And only now are people starting to listen to him.
Well, the thing is, I don't understand why he was so widely dismissed, because it's not as though we haven't seen this before with pertussis vaccine, which is a bacteria, not a virus, but it's the same principle. So what we know is that mass vaccination for pertussis has put evolutionary pressure on the bacteria to evolve, so that today all the strains of pertussis in circulation in the U.S. are lacking a specific antigen protein called protactin, which is one of the key antigen components of the vaccine. So in other words, it's evolved to try to escape vaccine-conferred immunity. So we've seen this. It's not like we haven't seen this before.
Yeah. Well, I want to respect your time. So before I get to the last thing that I want to ask you, I think I would just button up this section by saying, to anybody who's still, pretty committed to the standard, schedule and the standard line about this, I would just say that, consider the possibility that there are lots of credentialed, authoritative scientists that are raising questions, issuing concerns, doing deep, nuanced, and complex studies of these issues, and that it's not as simple as just what makes its way out into the press. And I would also say that it's so interesting to me that you sort of have these two parallel worlds to each other. On one track, you've got above the surface, you've got what you hear in the press and from our public health establishment, which is pretty uniform, pretty aligned in terms of the messaging and the content, which generally means, these are safe and effective, shut up and sit down. Meanwhile, you've got under the surface this entire realm of actual scientists and people studying the data, where there's raucous debate and lots of discussion going on and back and forth and analysis and comparison. That, it doesn't mean that the received narrative in the public is wrong. It just means that there's more to it. And so you shouldn't just accept at face value what you hear. And there are people that are experts that have different opinions. And so consider that.
Yeah. If you're getting only information from the mainstream media, you're uninformed, or misinformed, rather, I should say.
Okay, so the last thing I wanted to ask you about, since this is a key part of your book about Dr. Thomas, is the study that he did that got peer reviewed and released, and is what I think triggered the response, the pretty overt response from the medical board. Tell me about that study briefly.
Yeah, that's real important. I'm glad you came back to that. So what happened was, Dr. Paul kind of saw the writing on the wall. He knew that, the medical board was trying to build a case against him. He could sense that. And so he knew that he needed to try to show that the patients in his clinic, that his approach is working. And so he had, but he did it very objectively. He was willing to consider the possibility that maybe what I'm doing is wrong. And so certainly if what I'm doing is not producing better health outcomes, I certainly want to know about that. So I'm going to take an honest look at my data and see, is what I'm doing working, or am I actually harming my children? In which case, yeah, I need to change my practice. I need to do things differently, because he's a very, I mean, when you talk to the guy, he's just such a humble, sincere person. And certainly he comes across as very honest to me, and self-critical. I mean, obviously he's self-critical, because he went from being, again, that the mainstream type of doctor where he's just going to follow the CDC schedule and do what he was told, to asking questions and then changing his approach. So he's certainly a self-critical individual. And so he had independent analysis done of his patient data, which ultimately led to the publication of a study on, I believe it was November 22nd, 2020, was published. And what it showed was that, it was not a comparison of like fully vaccinated versus unvaccinated children, because he didn't have many patients in his practice who were fully vaccinated. Again, a lot of the parents came to him precisely because they wanted to kind of take their own approach. And so he had certainly a lot of vaccinated children, but they were vaccinated according to, many different kind of schedules. And so they were just variably vaccinated individuals. He compared the variably vaccinated children in his practice, the health outcomes, with health outcomes for completely unvaccinated children. And the results showed with statistical significance that the unvaccinated children had less diagnoses for various health conditions, as well as less incidence of office visits for various diagnoses, which was a more powerful, statistically powerful measure, because it not only, so with incidence of diagnosis, which is kind of a typical approach to these types of studies, it's just like, do they have a diagnosis of this disease? Yes or no. It's this kind of, binary approach, whereas they kind of developed a different measure called relative incidence of office visits, that not only allowed them to say, okay, did they have a condition or not, but also how frequently did they have to go to the doctor for that condition, which kind of speaks more to severity. So it's more informative. And so they also use that measure. And so looking at a broad range of different, health conditions and health outcomes. And so the data clearly indicated that that the unvaccinated kids were the healthiest kids in his practice. And within about a week of that study being published, the Oregon Medical Board held an emergency meeting and emergently suspended his license, despite the fact that the Oregon Medical Board had requested that study. They had requested him. So, they were challenging, they were accusing him of, straying from standard of care with his what they call his alternative schedule, which is a reference to the vaccine friendly plan. So number one, they don't understand his vaccine friendly plan, because they think it's like some alternative one size fits all approach, which is completely contrary to the whole concept. So they don't even get the whole concept. But setting that aside, they had requested him to produce peer reviewed evidence that his approach was working. So he did.
Well, it sounded like they called his bluff, and then he said, "Hold my beer."
I think that they thought that would be a hoop that he would never be able to jump through.
Yeah.
I think that they assumed that he would never be able to produce any kind of data, but he just took his own patient data and he had it analyzed, and then he published the results.
Now, do you want to mention that it has been retracted, but
yes,
most likely for political reasons?
Right. I was just going to say that. Yeah. So your audience should know that study has, well, first of all, prior to that, so number one, the one major development since I kind of wrote the article that led to the book was that the Oregon Medical Board did conditionally withdraw its suspension order.
Really?
So that was kind of a positive development.
I hadn't heard that.
They did. Yeah. So he was able to practice again, but he can't have anything to do with vaccinations. Like, when other practitioners in his clinic are the ones who have to kind of like be in the room with the parents and having that discussion about vaccines. Like, he's not allowed to like.
But the other physicians are still having the same informed consent driven discussion. I mean, are the parents getting the same content? It's just not delivered through Dr. Paul's mouth?
I believe so. Yeah. Because I mean, that is the founding principle of the clinic, right? So everyone who works there is on board with the idea of, well, we're just going to give the information, whatever information the parents need, and then they can make their own informed choice. Because nobody has the knowledge of the individual child like the parents do. Nobody does. Not even their pediatrician has that kind of intimate knowledge of that child's health, and all the factors that go into that decision-making process. So that was one thing. But then, just what was it, July? I don't know the date exactly. I can't remember. But the study was retracted. Now, if you look at the notice of retraction published by the editors of that journal, there's not a single substantive criticism of the study. They just say, oh, well, we found that the conclusions are not scientifically valid or something. They're not supported by the data or something. And that's it. And so because of the concerns about the methodology, and we're going to pull the study. It's just so vague that so what specifically, like, give us a specific, like, what was wrong with the study? They didn't do that. And that's interesting because I happen to know that, so the retraction was based on an anonymously written letter to the editors complaining about the study. And I happen to know that Dr. James Lyons-Weiler, who's the co-author with Dr. Paul Thomas of that study, they had contacted, they were informed by the editors of this letter and this complaint, and they proposed, well, publish the letter and then publish our response to it.
Yeah.
Editors refused. So they refused to air and bring out to the light, like, what these criticisms were, number one.
Yeah.
And then refusing to allow the authors to have a response to them, which would have been a perfectly reasonable approach. And so in lieu of that, in lieu of having that process and that open dialogue and that open debate, they decided to keep it a secret what the criticisms even were, and just retract the study and say, well, there's criticisms of the study and we're retracting it because we agree with criticisms. But okay, that's your opinion. What happened to the debate and the discussion and the transparency?
Well, it clearly made it through the peer review process initially. Like, that, their response is, I don't know how you can think of anything other than that it's damning of their motives, and that they're not actually doing science. It's CYA mode.
It's so clearly political in nature, like you said. Yes. And I think that's just evident just based on the way that they withdrew the study, and again, refusing the proposal to, well, publish. I mean, Dr. Jack, or Dr. James Lyons-Weiler, he's also known as Dr. Jack. Just Dr. Paul Thomas is affectionately known as Dr. Paul. So Dr. Jack and Dr. Paul, I mean, again, they had proposed, like, let's just air this out. Like, let's go ahead, publish it. They weren't saying, oh, we don't want that to reach the light of day. They were the ones saying, no, publish this criticism, do it. And they refused. They don't want the criticism published. I mean, consider that. I mean, that says everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. All right. Well, I really appreciate your time, Jeremy. And for anyone listening, I really would recommend that you go and read his book, that you get on his newsletter, read his content. One of the things that I really do appreciate about your writing is just the way that you unpack all of the claims being made by going straight into the studies, and you show how they're often misrepresented, or even they might say the exact opposite of what they are used to justify, in the news or in various public health pronouncements. So it's your writing is very careful, it's very readable, and it's very thorough, and so it's a great analysis. I highly recommend all of your content. And again, the book is The War on Informed Consent, The Persecution of Dr. Paul Thomas by the Oregon Medical Board. Where can people find you online if they want to track you down?
Yeah, go to jeremyrhammond.com. And right at the top of my homepage there, you'll see a form to sign up for my newsletter. So definitely jump on my newsletter, because I send out all kinds of exclusive subscriber-only content. I might not be publishing articles that frequently, but I'm in the meantime, unbeknownst to the broader public, I'm sending all kinds of great content via my newsletters. So definitely you want to be signed up for that.
Great. And I will link to all of those things on the show notes page as well.
Great.
Thanks for your time.
You bet.
Well, that closes out episode 18. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Head on over to closemindedpodcast.com/18 for links to everything that we covered. That includes Jeremy's book, his website that contains tons of excellent reporting on the vaccine industry, including a devastating deep dive into the flu vaccine that is a must read. That was actually written pre-COVID, and I highly recommend it. I also recommend you get on his email list. He delivers a lot of content that's not available anywhere else, including his website. So that's got a lot of good stuff in it. And remember, if you want to secure your internet connection, go to closemindedpodcast.com/VPN to get 72% off of Nord's 2-year plan. See you next time.